See if we can get this thing going on here. Just a second. Today we're going to be in the book of 1 Timothy. So we're making a change. We're going to do a series on 1 Timothy between now and Christmas. And so if you want to start reading some or looking some or studying some, 1 Timothy is going to be the passage we're going to be looking at. So the 1 Timothy is kind of, I can relate to him. First, Timothy was a young guy who went along with Paul. And we'll talk a little bit about his different escapades and things that were happening. Today will be basically just an introduction. Next week we'll be going actually starting at verse 3 and going through that. But I can relate because when I first became a pastor, I was 30 years old. And at my first church, in fact, back then was when I grew a beard so I'd look a little bit older because nobody would, they didn't take you seriously, because you're such a young guy. And by the time I came here, I was 35 years old. And that was possibly when 1 Timothy was written to Timothy. He was possibly 35 years old taking over Ephesus. But he had had a lot of stuff go on before that had taken place. And so I called this morning building a bench. Because we always have to think about who's going to be with us and follow on and take over different things. And I'm going to take a few minutes as I start. So I'm going to ask Nate and Mariah if they're going to come up here. Would you please come up for a second? And Josh, you come on up here too. These three have been with us. Josh has been here for, 2 years now, I think. 4 years? Really? Freshman year? Wow. Okay. He was with Josh Hansley for a while and so forth, so he's been with us on music. And I just want to let you know that this year he's going to be on staff with us. Okay? So that's good. We're actually he's in his senior year. I'd like him to stay around. He talks about going to California all over the place next year. Love to see him stay around, but we have him through this coming year, and he actually has, we're going to be paying him for a little bit. We stole him away from his cafeteria job over there. So when I go, he can't make me an omelet anymore now. He's going to be making music, and he's going to be working for us and trying to work into, has a regular job description. He'll be working with maybe our young people and so forth, just trying to bring our music awareness up in some of the other areas of our church and get some great experience for himself. But he's got a lot of good experience in his background, so we're glad to have that. And then Nate and Mariah Wilson. Nate's father is Chuck Wilson up at the New Hope, our church up there, New Hope. And Nate and Mariah are both students over at Karen. And Mariah did a fantastic job. She was here all summer with us at the daycare, taking care of kids. And I have a picture that I showed her, and I think I sent it to your dad or your mom or to Chuck about it. But I remember being out of Fellowship Hall one day, and I'm looking around. Everybody's talking, oblivious to everything going off. And I look over the corner, and there's Mariah down on her knees playing with Emmett. Just talking to him and so forth. I mean, she just really loves children, does a fantastic job. She's going to be coming back on Mondays with us at the daycare working this coming year. But Nate we're bringing on as a pastoral intern. And so we gave him a small scholarship at Karen, but he's going to be with us for the year, and he'll be kind of following me around, and he'll be doing things that I would normally do possibly, or filling gaps, finding out what it's like to be a pastor of a church. And they're not sure if they're going they'd like to go in the full-time service, not sure if it's missions or maybe pastoral, whatever, but he'll find out what it's. Of course, after this year, you find out all the ins and outs of being a pastor. Might decide to be a missionary. But actually, they already started, and Nate was been anxious in the beginning of the year. He said, I was thinking September, school year starts, and he says, well, I'm around. What do you want me to do? And the church bulletin, their church director we have is actually a result of his work for 3 or 4 weeks, actually taking on that project and doing it for us. So they're both fully involved now. So I'm excited about these 3 individuals being on board with us this coming year and what's going to happen. And so I just want to make that officially announcement to you. They've both been doing stuff over the summer. We've seen them around, but that's where their plan is. So if you see them, that's Nate and Mariah and Josh. And thank you all for being on board with us this year. Take care. And building the bench is what's all. It's taking other folks and helping them to actually learn and be able to do ministry and so forth. And we all should be doing that. Red is another one who has spent some time overseas with us, and so we gave her an opportunity. We'll hear from Abby in a couple of weeks about her mission trip. And that's what we need to do. We need to build the bench. And so, young people, you're important to us. You're going to be the ones that are going to be doing things in the future and leading the church through the next ages. So, as opportunities arise, get involved, find something to do. But we're going to talk about Timothy, and Timothy is one of those, as we said, who's kind of a starter. And it's kind of early on his career, and we're going to find out about how he got into ministry a little bit today. And if you take a look at the scriptures, if you will, and look at 1 Timothy chapter 1, we're going to start with just the first two verses. Let me read these to you, and then we'll go back and take a look at some other things that's coming up. Pastor Ken, could you give me a glass of water, please? I feel my throat going already. It's going to be a little dry here. Paul, an apostle of Christ Jesus, according to the commandment of God our Savior, and of Christ Jesus, who is our hope, to Timothy, my true child in the faith, grace, mercy, and peace from God the Father and Christ our Lord. Paul calls himself an apostle. What's an apostle? Anybody know? Sent one, right? Very good. Sent one. So somewhat, the modern day sent ones are people like Retta or Abby or any of the other 8 missionaries that we support, foreign or home. Those are the sent ones. Back in the day of Jesus Christ, he had 12 apostles, and then he had another apostle who got added in to complete their 12. And then Paul, if you remember, Paul became an apostle. Now, these apostles were official positions, a little bit different from our missionaries today, because there aren't other apostles in the sense of these guys who were apostles, because there were certain criteria for the apostles of old. If you look in the scriptures, you can find, and I'll give you a few verses here if you want to look up through, but in Acts chapter 9, verses 3 through 7, Paul talks about how he was specifically called, and it was the experience of him being called on the road to Damascus. And if you look at the other disciples, Jesus went and chose each one of them. So for an apostle in the New Testament under Jesus Christ, he actually called them to be apostles or disciples of his. And although Paul says, I was kind of one of the late ones. Thank you very much, Pastor Ken. There you go, my right-hand man. He said when he called Paul, he said, Paul, I actually saw Jesus on the road to Damascus, and he called me also. So one was the calling. The second thing that was critical was that they have been a witness of the resurrected Christ. So Paul had seen Jesus at that point on the road to Damascus, so he had seen the resurrected Christ. The others had witnessed the resurrection. If you remember when Peter was trying to find a replacement for one of the 12, he said, let's pick someone who has been with us the entire time and has seen Jesus Christ risen, because they wanted to be witnesses of what took place. Today, none of us have seen Jesus, the risen Christ, but we have the scriptures, which are the reports of those who have seen Jesus Christ. So we know through the scriptures. But sent ones, we still need to have sent ones today, and we call them missionaries. So if you compare the qualifications and of who those people were, we find that Paul went out and started a lot of churches and so forth. Now today there are some churches that believe in what's called apostolic succession. And they believe, the Roman Catholic Church believes that Paul, that their pope is a successor to Peter. Okay, if you go to the Mormon Church, they have apostles, that they and they're a church that believe in the succession of apostolic authority from then to now. We don't believe. We believe that the scriptures are the authority, and that as we understand the scriptures written by the apostles, then we know what the word has to say. I remember when I was overseas in the Philippines as a missionary for 6 months. And I've had a couple of overseas missionary experiences, and I'll tell you, we would like to continue to develop those with our church. We've had a number of trips to, to Haiti and to Dominican Republic and so forth, but they're really, they can be life-changing for you. I was in the Philippines for 6 months with Lois, and over there, our mentor was a Roman Catholic priest who had been actually as one of the seminary profs in the Catholic seminaries over there. And he'd gotten converted, come to Jesus Christ as his sole means of faith, and was actually a missionary with the Conservative Baptist Foreign Mission Society at the time, or now the mission we mostly support, World Venture. And one statement he told me was really hit me in a sense. He said, if you had the choice of Jesus Christ standing here and talking to you and telling you to do something, or the Pope standing here and telling me to do something, he said, I would have to, with Catholic theology, and of course there's a Catholic theologian from the seminary, he said, I would have to listen to the Pope, because he is the current day vicar of Christ. He has Christ's words. And it shows the authority that they put on what the Pope says or what other authorities say other than the Scriptures. We believe that the Scriptures are the authority, and what they say is based on what the apostles have taught us through the Scriptures. And so consequently, we look at the Bible and say, this is God's authority. We don't look to any man. And whether it's Sun Myung Moon or whoever that guy was in China, years ago, or some new person has come along and saying, I'm the Messiah, or I have a revelation, and some people will follow him because there's an Antichrist coming. And at some point, people will say, this man's got the truth. But who has the truth? The Word of God is the truth. And so we need to read and listen to the Scriptures, know the Scriptures ourselves, so we know when someone's teaching us falsehood. So don't come to church and expect to get everything from me or from whatever preacher might be up here. You need to study, you need to look at the Scriptures yourself. So that way we have Sunday school classes, and we have life groups, and we have other ways in which you can learn the Scriptures. So let's take a look at this, because Paul was the one that was the sent one, and he was an apostle, and he brought along Timothy. And so as I said, as I started out early on as a pastor, I was a young guy, and I had to learn. Fortunately, I'd grown up in the church. My father was a pastor, and so I had his advice. And so you might say I was mentored by my father, much like Nate growing up, mentored by our parents in the ministry. But we need that person to bring us along. And so before we go in and look at actually Timothy and start studying what Paul is telling Timothy, as Timothy takes over a church, the church at Ephesus, and there's some difficulties and challenges there, we want to take a look and see what was Timothy's background and how did he come along. So take with me, you won't be looking exactly at all of these verses, but let's start off with Acts chapter 14, if you will, because we need to look back at what took place in Acts chapter 14 to really understand the background of how Timothy came along. So back to Acts, we were in Acts chapters 1 through 10, if you remember, with Peter. And then after chapter 11 or so forth, it kind of turns over, but we have Paul and 9, we see a little bit more of Peter, and then Peter kind of passes off the scene in the book of Acts, and we pick up with Paul himself. And so if you want to look at chapter 14, Paul is going on his first missionary journey, and he's going around, and he gets into Lystra, a place called Lystra, Lystra. And it talks about that in Acts 14, which is what we're going to look at. And there are a number of things that take place in Lystra that are interesting. First of all, he comes to Lystra after getting thrown out of Iconium, okay? Iconium was a town maybe 20 miles away, and they were threatening to stone him. So he left there and came to Lystra. And we find that as we look here, it says in verse 3, therefore they spent a long time there speaking boldly with reliance upon the Lord, who was bearing witness to the word of his grace, granting that signs and wonders be done by their hands. But the multitude of the city was divided, and some sided with the Jews, and some sided with the apostles. And when an attempt was made by both the Gentiles and the Jews with their rulers to mistreat and to stone them, they became aware of it and fled to the cities of Lycaonia, Lystra, and Derbe, and the surrounding region, and there they continued to preach the gospel. So, threatening stoning at one place, they go to another town in order to share the gospel, and Lystra was where they wound up. We pick it up here at chapter 14 in this part. Now, it says one of the towns they went to was Derbe, D-E-R-B-E. Just a side note, Lois's father, Pastor Brown, who's be in our second service, he was a pastor in Derby Line, Vermont. And Derby Line was right next to Derby, Vermont. And it's spelled the same exact way, D-E-R-B-E. So a lot of our places here in the United States are actually named after places overseas and from the Scriptures. But Derby was one of the places where they went. Lystra was another one. Why am I talking about Lystra? I thought we were going to talk about Timothy. Well, guess where Timothy grew up? In Lystra. He's not mentioned in chapter 14 here, but I believe that he probably knew this background, and it tells us that his mother and his grandmother were very strong in their faith and were the ones that brought him up in his faith. And so even if he was just a young kid, maybe even a child at the time, I know that he was aware of these circumstances. So let's look at what happened once he got to Lystra and started preaching there. In verses 8 through 10, and I'll just give you a little bit of synopsis. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can read it if you want, if you're at that passage. But there was a man who was lame from birth. And from verses 8 through 10, it talks about this man was lame, and Paul healed him. When Paul healed him, everybody that was there, what are they expecting? They're expecting, just a regular, they're believing in the gods, Zeus and Hermes and all these kind of things. They're not seeing miracles take place. All of a sudden, he heals this man, and they believe they're gods. And if you look along at verses 11 through 13, it says, this is interesting, they say they start honoring them as gods. And in verse 11 it says, when the multitude saw what Paul had done, they raised their voice, saying in the Lycaonian language, the gods have become like men and have come down to us. And they began calling Barnabas, if you remember, Barnabas was Paul's companion, they called him Zeus, and they called Paul Hermes because Paul was the chief speaker. And Hermes was the guy that would speak. Zeus was kind of like the head of all the gods. And so they gave them names, and they were ready to honor them as this. Well, as the story goes on in verses 14 through 18, they tried to stop the people. Please, we're just men like you. Please do not offer sacrifices to us. We are not gods. We are representing a God who you don't know. And in fact, he says about here, he says, men, why, verse 15 I am, if you're following, verse 15, it said, men, why are you doing these things? We are also men of the same nature as you, and preach the gospel to you in order that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, and this living God made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. And in the generations gone by, he permitted all the nations to go their own ways, and yet he did not leave himself without a witness. So we bring the word witness back in because Paul realizes he's a witness to what Jesus Christ did. Do they believe him? Well, some of the troublemakers from the previous towns, they come over with them, and they influence the people of Lystra. And if we drop down into verse 19, you'll see what happened. It says, and Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, that's the place they just got thrown out of. Having won over the multitudes, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing him to be dead. But while the disciples stood around him, he arose and entered the city. And the next day he went away with Barnabas to Derbe. So consequently, we find out here that they stoned Paul and thought he was dead. But he gets up and walks back into the city. Now, we don't know, and this is the big theological question some guys go over, did he actually die and God raised him from the dead? Or was he just so beaten up with the stones that he was basically unconscious and got up? We don't know. However, there's a passage and I'm not going to read it, but if you look at 2 Corinthians 12, 1-5, he talks about having a vision of heaven in 2 Corinthians. And like he saw the heavens opened up. And some people some theologians believe that this is the reference that he is making back to when he was stoned and left for dead. And whether he was unconscious and had this vision of heaven, or whether he actually died and went to heaven and came back to life. This is the reference they talk about. In Galatians and also in chapter 6, it talks about him bearing in his body the marks of Jesus. In fact, in the scriptures, it's called the brand marks of Jesus. And some think this is what the experience to what he might refer. Now, can you imagine being someone who is a believer in that town and seeing someone you know, let's say me, see somebody drag me out of the church and stone me, and you think I'm dead? There are places in the world where this is happening. Not necessarily stoning, but they are taking pastors out and putting them in prison. They're taking believers and putting them in prison. They're taking women who have converted and from a Muslim community because they are not protected anymore, and they're taken out. Around the world, Christians are being persecuted. Can you imagine the effect this has? Can you imagine the effect it would have on a young person? Some of you have, imagine back when you were 5 years old, or if you had children that were maybe 5 years old, what kind of effect do you think it would have on them? I'm convinced that Timothy knew of this experience if he did not see it himself. As we follow on, we come back. Paul, in his second missionary journey, comes back to the town of Lystra. And we find this in chapter 16. So if you just move over 2 chapters from chapter 14 over to chapter 16, you find that it says here, and he came also to Derbe and to Lystra, and behold, a certain disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, and his father was a Greek. So I have a map up here just so you can see some of these things if you want to look at the front here. Antioch and Iconium are both underlined. There's some of the top ones there, and I'm not sure if you can see them all the way from the back there. So I've underlined them right under the word Galatia. That's where the believers were. That's where the people were that came to Lystra in order to stir up trouble. He left Iconium and went to Lystra and Derbe, and Derbe is the other one that's underlined there. So you get an idea of where these towns are in Asia Minor, which is current-day Turkey. So if you think, Turkey really today has a lot of Christian background in it. The churches from Revelation, where are they at? Well, they're in Turkey. And Ephesus, which was the church that this letter, 1 Timothy, was written to Timothy at. He was at Ephesus at the time. Ephesus was also the place where John, the disciple John, was till the later days of his life. He was in Ephesus, and you'll see on the map there, you can see it's all the way over to the left or to the west, right on the coastline of the Mediterranean. And so it's a little further away, but it's still in Asia Minor, and that's where Timothy was at the time 1 Timothy was sent to him. So he's actually a son. He lives in Lystra. Let me just give you a little bit of background. It says that he was already the disciple in Acts chapter 16. So evidently, he came to faith and had started to develop, and quite possibly, we don't know, his conversion is not given anywhere in Scripture, but it may be that maybe he was old enough on that first missionary trip in Acts 14 when he saw Paul stoned, that's where he came to faith. Because as we read it in Timothy, it says he calls him his true child in the faith. Now that can refer to two things. It can say he actually won him to Jesus Christ, or it can put that he's the true child in the faith as compared to some of the others in Ephesus who were not true children in the faith. They were imposters. They were giving some false doctrine. But Paul had a very close relationship with Timothy. His mother was Jewish. His father was Greek. That means that when he was born, he was not circumcised. I'm not going to go to describe what circumcised is. If you don't know, you can ask your parents or come up and talk to me afterwards. But because his mom was a Jew, and Paul was going to the Jews first and then to the Greeks, the Jews, he felt, would not accept Timothy as a person because they felt he's never been circumcised. And since his mother, and because of his mother was a Jew, and a lot of times the heritage of the Jewish faith comes through the mother, Paul had him circumcised at that point. So he's not circumcised 8 years of age. This is at probably a teenager being circumcised. Now, I can't imagine that. You know, they don't have the same kinds of stuff we have today, things on instruments and Novocaine and all this other kind of stuff, but they circumcised him because they wanted him to be able to have a good reputation with the Jews where Paul was going to speak. The father was probably a non-believer, but we're told later on that the mother and grandmother both had a very impactful position in Timothy's life in bringing him to faith and training him. Let's move on. This is Timothy's introduction. Let me move on to the second thing, or the third thing, actually, I'd like to show this more, and that's Timothy's mentorship under Paul. So Paul finds him in Acts chapter 16 and decides to take him with him. If you read in verse 3, it says, "And Paul wanted this man, Timothy, to go with him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those parts, for they all knew that his father was a Greek. Now, while they were passing through the cities, they were delivering the decrees which had been decided upon by the apostles and elders who were in Jerusalem for them to observe. So the churches were being strengthened in their faith and were increasing in number daily." So he takes Timothy with him. Now, let me just give you a little bit of background, something actually I didn't see till recently, maybe even this week as I was studying for this particular sermon. Paul's first missionary journey, who did he go out with? It was Paul and Barnabas, okay? And they took along with them a young protege who was named John Mark. John Mark was a young kid. Anybody know John Mark's relationship to Barnabas? Yes. John Mark was Barnabas' nephew, or Barnabas was his uncle. So there was a family relationship. Barnabas' name also means son of encouragement. So he was always an encourager. Partway through their first missionary journey, what did John Mark do? Yeah, he quit. It's tough. When you're a young kid going along, you see a lot of stuff, and maybe he felt, I'm the gopher. I don't know why he did it, but he abandoned them, and he stopped halfway through the first missionary journey. When they come, and this happens between chapter 14, where we talked about Lystra, first time in Lystra, and chapter 16, where Paul takes Timothy on. If you look at the top of chapter 15, in fact, I'll read it. It's only a couple verses here. And they're going out on the second missionary journey. It says in 15:37, and Barnabas was desirous to take John, called Mark, along with them also. But Paul kept insisting that they should not take him along because he had deserted them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And there arose such a sharp disagreement that they were separated from one another, and Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus, and Paul chose Silas and departed, being committed by the brethren to the grace of the Lord. Even preachers and those you respect can get into arguments, can't they? These two guys had a definite falling out, Barnabas and Paul. Barnabas said, he's my nephew, I'm an encourager, let's give him a second chance. Paul said, absolutely not. The kid quit on me. I'm not going to have that again. Not taking him. Sometimes things that seem bad happen for good. Now, instead of one missionary team going out, what do we have? Two missionary teams going out. And we have Barnabas taking John Mark and going on their way down to Cyprus to continue ministry. And we have Paul taking Silas. And since Luke, who is the author of Acts, goes with Paul, we get to follow him around. We don't really know what happened to Barnabas after that. At least I don't. I don't know where he went or how much of an impact he had, but there were two missionary teams. And I find it interesting. Paul didn't go by himself, did he? On the first missionary team, he took Barnabas. On the second missionary team, he took On the first missionary team, they took a young kid with them named, they didn't have a young kid to take with them on the second missionary journey. So what happens after they separate? The very next chapter, chapter 6, verses 1 through 16, verses 1 through 3, we find Paul going to Lystra and inviting who to go along with him? Timothy. Now he's got the young protege to go. I'd like to suggest that it's always good to have someone that we're training to take a position. We should not always be just doing things ourselves. We should be trying to train a young one. Paul went with a partner and also with someone else, which is why I call this Timothy's mentoring under Paul. Timothy was got to get the ride of his life. He was going to see the world. He was going to see Paul in action. He was going to learn how to be a Christian and how to be a pastor, how to handle tough circumstances. In fact, we'll find that Paul actually sent Timothy a lot of times. He was kind of his gopher to tough situations. He say, the Corinthians are doing this, go there. In fact, let me just read some of these to you if I can. But let me just give you this illustration before I do. I call this sermon Build the Bench. Anybody know the name Nick Foles? If you don't, I won't embarrass you by making you to raise your hand. Did you know Nick Foles thought about quitting? He was playing for the Rams. In fact, I've got I cut a little bit of the article here. It says, in fact, let me just read it. His year with the Rams was so difficult, so miserable, so unfulfilling that when the 2015 season ended, Nick Foles thought about giving it all up. He was 26 years old. Foles, just 2 years removed from his stark Pro Bowl season with the Eagles, said in a recent interview that he really considered retiring when his season with the Rams ended at 26 years of age. Yes, I sat there and talked to my wife, Foles said. You go through a lot of emotions, changing teams, being traded, going there, going through that year. And once I was a free agent, we just sort of sat there and said, hey, what do we want to do? It was the first time I had been a free agent in my career, and it was the first time I had to make a decision because I was drafted and traded before. I was leaning towards not playing and stepping back. When the Rams selected Jared Goff with the first pick in the draft, Foles asked to be released, and he was. My wife and I kept talking for months, and when I was free, I talked with Coach Andy Reid for a while, and then I took a break, he said. I went on a camping trip with my brother. I came back, and my wife and I kept talking and just prayed about it. We made the decision to go back and play for Andy Reid. Nick Foles now is an online student, I don't know if you know that, with Liberty University getting his Master of Divinity degree. His goal is to be a pastor when he leaves the football realm. But he is a dedicated born-again believer. But here's a guy that considered quitting at 26 years of age. but he came back and kept on going. We shouldn't quit. We need to build a bench. When he went with the Eagles, they've never played. But when Wentz got hurt, all of a sudden he's in the limelight. We need to build our bench because we aren't going to be here forever. Let me just give you a little bit of what Timothy did when he went along with Paul. They traveled to Philippi in Acts chapter 16. In chapter 17, they went to Thessalonica, Berea, and I have this chart on your little paper there. Take your paper out, if you will, your notes, okay? And as I read these places, look for them on the paper, the maps in front of you. In fact, circle them and underline them and see where some of the places that Timothy went. He traveled to Philippi. Then he went to Thessalonica, Berea, and stayed behind together as Paul traveled to Athens, stayed in Berea. He possibly sent then Timothy back to Thessalonica. Silas and Timothy joined Paul at Corinth for 18 months. Then Timothy went to Macedonia and to Corinth. Timothy was then later found in Troas. He was then with Paul when Paul was in prison in Rome, because he's mentioned at the beginning of Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon. If I could, and I don't think I have time, so I'm not going to do it right now, but I could read the scriptures from all those different chapters, from 1 Corinthians and from Philemon and Colossians and so forth, and you'd find him mentioned at all those various places. He followed around, and Paul mentored him as he took them to all those places, and he actually became his emissary, and he sent him whenever he had problems someplace. He said, I'm ministering here, you go there and take place in it. One time when Moody had a crusade, he came home and he said, had 2.5 people saved tonight. 2.5 people? What do you mean 2.5 people saved? Oh, you had 2 adults and a child that got saved. That's neat. He says, no. I had 2 children and an adult that got saved. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, the adult already has half their life gone. The 2 children's got their whole lives ahead of them. I had 2.5 souls saved tonight. It's important that we consider that what do we have ahead of us? If we are one of those adults, we need to be building the bench. We need to be mentoring others. If we're a kid, or a young person, if you're young, you've got your whole life ahead of you. What are you going to do for Jesus Christ? Timothy chose to join up with Paul and go on an exciting trip in order to minister and preach the gospel. I could say, what is your legacy? And a lot of parents and adults would say what their legacy is. But my question really isn't that. My question is, who is your legacy? Who is your legacy? When you retire, when you go off to heaven, who is your legacy? Who will you leave behind that will continue the Lord's work? What impact have you had? It's not the guy you left at work. It's not the guy you trained at work, or the woman you trained at work. It's not the position you held at work. It's not the fact that you wound up being married for a number of years. But it's, what about your children? What about the children in the church? What about others you are mentoring? Will they go on and continue? Paul sends Timothy to Ephesus. And as he goes to Ephesus, there's a number of problems there. And so Paul writes to Timothy when he first gets to Ephesus, and 1 Timothy, that we're going to start next week, is the letter he wrote to them. And he deals with a lot of problems, and some of them are going to be tough to preach on. He deals with elders, deacons, women in the church, eating certain foods, marriage, the widow's conduct, wine, money. All of that stuff he handles in Timothy, and we're going to touch on all of it as we go through the book of Timothy, and Paul tells him how to handle things in Ephesus. There's 4 lessons I'd like you to leave with today, and they're all at the bottom of your thing there if you'd like to write them out and keep them up, because I think we learned a number of lessons this morning from Timothy's background. First of all, find a place to serve Jesus. If you're not serving someplace in the church, if you haven't found some place, find a place. There's the welcome team. There's Awana at 4 o'clock, listen to kids' verses. There's different, there's the nursery. There's the tech team up there helping them. There's all kinds of places where you can minister. Find a place to serve. Secondly, never quit serving regardless of the cost. Timothy gave up his life at home, maybe a business, job, whatever. He went with Paul in order to serve God. And he continued to serve. John Mark quit, but later on it's kind of good news because Paul says, John Mark is profitable to me for the ministry. John Mark turned around. He stayed with Barnabas, and he is mentioned later on by Paul. Third thing, always have a mentor to teach. Always have someone that you're bringing along behind you to take your place, to learn what you're doing. Even if they don't take your place, maybe you're teaching them how to do the things. We've had some young people at the church, and I've been excited. I'm not going to embarrass them by telling their names, but you're going to hear from one of them in 2 weeks, who wound up taking charge of the fellowship committee, became a co-chairman of the fellowship committee, and continued to work on that. As a young person, less than 18 years of age, they learned, and the person that was in charge of it had someone to teach. And then lastly, start young to serve God. Start young to serve God. You folks that are younger people, you got a whole life to serve God. You're the full person, you know. Half of your life's not gone. Find a place to serve. Find a place to do what's right. Because a lot of people make that decision after they get to be 30, 40, 50, 60 years of age. And they don't got as much time to correct the stuff they did wrong. But you've got a chance now. Start right. Serving God is both a privilege and responsibility, and I hope you will all do that. We will follow Timothy as he does that through the next weeks. Dear Lord, we just thank you for Timothy. Thank you for his dedication to you. We ask that you might help us to not only take our lead on what he was like and what he did, but also that we might be encouraged as we see some of the things that he says and he's taught by Paul, as Paul mentors him as a young preacher, young pastor, young leader in the Ephesus church. In Jesus' name, amen.